Once again, it's time to take a journey back to 1969 and take a look at the records that hit the shelves in June of that year. So without further ado, let's begin. More was Pink Floyd's third album and the soundtrack to the film of the same name. And it was also the first Floyd album made entirely without Syd Barrett's involvement. The record found the group experimenting with a surprisingly wide range of styles, as evidenced by folk-tinged tracks like Green is the Color and Cymbeline and the very hypnotic Cirrus Minor. But one of the strongest songs on the album was the Nile song. The Nile song is by far the heaviest track Pink Floyd ever recorded, and considering that this was recorded and issued several months before the release of Black Sabbath's debut album, it's definitely quite remarkable for its heaviness and is no doubt one of the heaviest songs of the late 60s. More was a soundtrack album, and just like most soundtrack albums, it's a little uneven in places, and some of the instrumental pieces feel more effective within the context of the film than as standalone tracks. But there are still plenty of highlights here, and the album captures Pink Floyd at a fascinating transitional stage between the Syd Barrett era and the more progressive sound they would develop in the years that followed. Personally, I've always found More to be a bit overlooked in the Pink Floyd catalogue. It's not as consistent as the albums that came after it, but tracks like the Nile song alone are worth the price of admission. Beck-Ola was the second album by the Jeff Beck Group. At this point, the group still featured Rod Stewart on vocals, Ronnie Wood on bass, and Nicky Hopkins on keyboards. But Mickey Waller, who played drums on the first album, had been replaced by Tony Newman. The first album by the group, released a year earlier in 1968, received glowing reviews in the press. Its mix of strong blues influences with the heavier and more muscular sound that was beginning to emerge in the late 60s was seen as groundbreaking and highly original, and it went on to become a major influence on Led Zeppelin, whose debut album followed a very similar approach. Beck-Ola followed in the footsteps of that first album, although the material is generally not quite as strong and the production is not as effective. But still, there is plenty of good material here. At this point, Nicky Hopkins had become an official member of the band, and one of the highlights of the album is Girl from Mill Valley, a short instrumental piece written by Hopkins himself, which clearly shows why he was one of the most in-demand session players in Britain during that period. The album closes with Rice Pudding, an extended instrumental piece whose riff clearly shows just how much of an influence the Jeff Beck Group had on Led Zeppelin. Overall, Beck-Ola shows the group moving further towards a bluesy, heavy sound that would soon develop into early hard rock and heavy metal. It is less polished than some of its contemporaries, but its raw approach is part of its appeal.
My smile is stuck, I cannot go back to your frown land.
Trout Mask Replica was the third album by Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band. It was a double album produced by Frank Zappa, and it's widely regarded as one of the most unusual and challenging records ever released in rock music. It's one of those records that tends to divide listeners completely. Some people consider it an absolute masterpiece, while others think it's, well, a load of bollocks.
Let their nectar come into the air around her. She her love sticks out like stars. Don't give me no affliction, that old Thai religion is good enough for me.
Musically, it pulls from a huge range of influences, but everything is pulled apart and rearranged into something completely different and unpredictable. It's dense and chaotic, and it doesn't really follow conventional song structures. But even though the music may sound completely chaotic and random, the album was actually recorded after an intense period of rehearsals, with the band working through complex arrangements that were largely written by Beefheart and translated into music by the group. Personally speaking, I'm a big fan of albums like Safe as Milk and Clear Spot, but I honestly could never get into Trout Mask Replica. But still, I appreciate its uniqueness and the fact that even to this day it sounds like nothing else. Deep Purple, often referred to as Deep Purple 3, was the band's third studio album, and it was also the final album by the original lineup featuring Rod Evans on vocals and Nick Simper on bass. At this point, the band was still working with a sound that mixed early hard rock, progressive influences, and psychedelic elements. And these psychedelic elements are clearly evidenced by the inclusion of La Lena, a cover of a Donovan song.
That's your Latin life, Lelania. I can't blame ya.
But compared to their earlier releases, the album had a slightly darker and more baroque atmosphere. And in addition to that, even though John Lord's keyboards continued to play a central role in shaping the band's sound, this record saw Ritchie Blackmore's guitar work becoming more prominent, which gave the album a harder edge. By the time the record was released in June 1969, Deep Purple were already trying to convince Ian Gillan to join the group, who at the time was a member of a band called Episode 6 along with bassist Roger Glover. Gillan would not join Deep Purple unless his friend Roger Glover also joined the band, so eventually both Rod Evans and bassist Nick Simper were kicked out of the group, and the Mark II lineup with Gillan and Glover officially debuted just a month later with the release of the Hallelujah single in July 1969. Even though the first lineup of Deep Purple does not receive as much attention as later versions of the band, there is something truly special about their first three albums, and I think Deep Purple 3 is a much stronger album than is usually given credit for. Breathe Awhile was the only album by Arcadium, a British psychedelic band who were signed to the short-lived Middle-earth label. Just like a lot of smaller psych bands of the period, the group came out of the club circuit and recorded a single album before quickly disappearing. This is quite a good record that sits in the late 60s psychedelic space, with a slightly heavy underground feel running through much of it, and it's characterized by organ-driven arrangements and some excellent guitar work. The album wasn't a commercial success and largely went unnoticed, which is why it remained obscure for so long. Over time, however, it has been rediscovered by collectors and fans of late 60s British psychedelia, particularly those interested in the more underground side of the genre. And that renewed interest eventually led to the album being reissued by the Aoxomoxoa label in 2003. June 1969 also saw the release of the third album by Blue Cheer. The group's first two albums are often seen as foundational records in the development of heavy metal, and their debut in particular has frequently been cited by fans and critics as one of the earliest heavy metal albums. One of the key elements behind their early sound was the guitar work of Lee Stevens, whose bursts of wild, explosive fuzz guitar were unlike anything else from that period. But the guitarist left the group after the second album, and Blue Cheer never quite managed to reach that same level of heaviosity again. But still, this third album contains some very strong moments, particularly on the B-side. The record features material recorded with two different guitarists. The A-side features Bruce Stevens on guitar, and it sees the band moving towards a more restrained blues rock and country rock direction. But the best material is on the B-side, which features Randy Holden, who is often regarded as one of the early pioneers of heavy metal guitar. All of the tracks on the B-side were written by Holden himself, and they are generally considered the highlight of the record. With him, the band returned closer to the heavier sound of their earlier work, and the B-side alone is worth the price of admission. The album stalled at number 84 on the Billboard charts. A year later, in 1970, Randy Holden released his solo album Population 2, which is often considered to be one of the earliest examples of doom metal.
And now for something completely different.
And the skinny people want what the fat people got. And the fat people want what the skinny people.
June 1969 also saw the release of the first and only album by the Shaggs, a record that has become famous over the years because it's often been described as the worst album of all time, although musicians like Kurt Cobain and Frank Zappa used to cite it as one of their favorite albums and considered it a work of unintentional brilliance. The Shaggs were formed by three sisters from New Hampshire at the insistence of their controlling father, Austin Wiggin, who believed that his mother had predicted their rise to fame. The girls had absolutely no interest in becoming musicians, but their father forced them to practice every day. They never became proficient in songwriting or performing, but still their father paid for them to record their debut album, which was distributed in limited quantities by a local record label called Third World, and this was the result.
Foot, please answer me. I know where you are. You're behind that tree. Foot, aim with me and you things won't change. With me and you things will be the same. Our parents are the ones who really care. Our parents.
Philosophy of the World was recorded in a single day, and the recording sessions seem to have been almost as bizarre as the record itself. The album's engineer recalled that the three sisters looked miserable and really didn't want to be there. But their father dismissed the engineer's opinion that they were not ready, saying,
"I want to get them while they're hot."
Wiggin also insisted that their guitars did not need to be tuned, as he had purchased them at Sears. The engineer even hired session musicians to re-record parts, but their contributions were eventually dismissed because the session players were unable to follow the Shaggs' erratic tempos. At the time, the record basically went unnoticed and didn't make any impact, but over the years it picked up notoriety after appearing on several lists of the worst albums of all time. It also began to develop a cult following and eventually became one of the most well-known examples of what is now known as outsider music.
St. Stephen with a rose, in and out of the garden he goes. Country garden in the wind and the rain, wherever he goes, the people all complain.
June 1969 also saw the release of the third album by the Grateful Dead, widely considered to be one of the most ambitious studio projects of their career. It was one of the first rock albums to be recorded using 16-track technology, and the band took full advantage of the studio.
I just wonder if you shouldn't feel less concerned about the deeper mountains of the moon, electro mountains of the moon.
Crazy cat peeking through a lace, best that girl.
The record saw the Grateful Dead becoming much more adventurous in the studio, and it's often seen as the peak of their psychedelic period. Just a year later, the band would move towards a much more rootsy sound on Workingman's Dead and American Beauty. This one is probably not the easiest Grateful Dead album to get into, but if you're interested in the psychedelic side of the band, there's plenty here to enjoy. Hot Buttered Soul was the second studio album by Isaac Hayes, and the record that established him as one of the most distinctive voices in soul music. The album was built around long and expansive arrangements rather than short radio-friendly songs, marking a major departure from the more conventional soul format of the time.
And walk on by. Walk on.
The album contains just 4 tracks, 2 of which run for well over 10 minutes. This gave Hayes plenty of room to stretch out as both a vocalist and arranger, and the result was a sound that felt remarkably ambitious for a soul record of the period.
Let me stop procrastinating. Standing here. One woman's making my home.
At a time when many soul records were built around short singles, Hot Buttered Soul helped demonstrate that soul music could be just as ambitious and expansive as rock. It became one of the most influential albums of its era and played a major role in shaping the direction of progressive soul during the years that followed. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to June 1969. See you next time.